So, anybody here know who Frederick Buechner is? Buechner. So he's somebody worth being familiar with. He's a novelist, an essayist, a Christian writer, a Presbyterian minister. If you ever wanted a truly lovely novel about Christian mysticism, his book Godric, which recounts the life of a, I forget now what it is, 14th century, 13th century English hermit.
Did you spell the last name?
Yes, because I have it right here. Buechner. So he's also an occasional speaker on the fine art of homiletics, which means preaching. And I ran across a bundle of materials for Unitarian Universalists, a source that doesn't normally cite Presbyterian ministers, and they led with this. So, the sermon hymn comes to a close with a somewhat unsteady amen, and the organist gestures the choir to sit down. Fresh from breakfast and a quick run through the Sunday papers, the preacher climbs the steps to the pulpit with his sermon in hand. He hikes his black robe up at the knee so he will not trip over it on his way up. I know that image. I occupy a pulpit that's 15 feet in the air, and it was built pre-code. His mouth is a little dry. He has cut himself shaving. He feels as if he has swallowed an anchor. If it weren't for the honor of the thing, he would just as soon be somewhere else. In the front pews, the old ladies turn up their hearing aids, and a young lady slips her 6-year-old a lifesaver and a magic marker. A college sophomore home for vacation, who was there because he was dragged there, slumps forward with his chin in his hand. The vice president of a bank, who twice that week has seriously contemplated suicide, places his hymnal in the rack. A pregnant girl feels the life stir inside her. A high school math teacher, who for 20 years has managed to hold onto a secret about himself, creases his order of service down the center with his thumbnail and tucks it under his knee. The preacher pulls the little cord that turns on the lectern light and deals out the note cards like a riverboat gambler. The stakes have never been higher. 2 minutes from now, he may have lost his listeners completely to their own thoughts. But at this minute, he has them in the palm of his hand. The silence in the shabby church is deafening because everybody is listening to it. Everybody is listening, including even himself. Everybody knows the kind of things he has told them before and not told them. But who knows what this time, out of the silence, he will tell them. I suggest the project of giving a Dharma talk, like the project of the sermon, is terribly, terribly important. I was rummaging through the materials that were here, and I decided I'd steal this one. How to prepare a talk and exercise, talk, exercise, and tips, which I think most everybody here now has their own copy. This is first rate. It really is a wonderful little checklist, and I want to come back towards the end and revisit it, maybe midrash every small amount on it. The only thing that I found myself not fully understanding why was the lead, which was the purpose of the Dharma talk is to encourage practice. And absolutely is to encourage practice. But I would suggest it is always touching the matter of the heart. It is in fact the articulation of the Dharma. It is the invitation into our true nature. It is the invitation to heal and hurt. It's that important. And to that effect, I want to suggest that while I have heard people talk about Dharma talks and Te shows as qualitatively different things, Dharma talks are things what nobodies do. Te show are what Zen masters do. It's the great shout that startles us into our awakening. Similarly, I've heard people say a Dharma talk is nothing at all like a sermon. I suggest Dharma talk, Te show, sermon, they're the same. They are an individual who is never prepared properly. Standing, sitting in some manner before a gathering of people, waiting to hear a word that will be. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that we have, in this Shogaku Institute project, have dedicated so much time to considering different angles on what the Dharma talk might actually be. I was reading a critical analysis of the homiletic experience in seminary, and it was pointed out, and I can confirm it from my personal experience, that in the 3-year academic course of preparation for a minister, the typical seminarian takes one class in homiletics, and in the course of that one class speaks maybe twice. So already you're ahead of the game. It's really too bad for something that is, so critically important in my trade. It doesn't matter how good you are as a pastoral presence. It doesn't matter how well you can run a meeting. It doesn't matter what your skill sets are if you can't preach. There's simply, at least in the Unitarian Universalist world, which is a small universe, if you want to be a minister, it's a pulpit experience. You simply have to be able to do that. And people who are good at other things, it can really tear lives apart. My immediate predecessor in the church I currently serve was a great social justice person, did really good work. And it turned out the reason he was able to produce good sermons was he stole them from other people. And I occupy what's called an academic pulpit. A sex scandal might be workable with, but plagiarism is beyond. But for me, it was just an interesting thing just to watch the aftermath. Fortunately, for the sake of the congregation, he had only been there less than a year, from soup to nuts. Somebody thought, "Oh, this sermon is just so wonderful." I know he doesn't, print them, but it's so good. He's got to deliver it elsewhere. And she Googled a particularly stirring phrase, and she found it. And it turned out pretty much everything he wrote. For us, I think the point there is not don't steal your sermons. I mean, really, that's not. If you take from one person, that's plagiarism. If you take from 5, it's research. Don't When I my homiletic experience was at the City School of Religion in Berkeley, California. I picked my class by when it was offered in the day, and had no idea what to expect. It was a small seminar, smaller than this class here. As we walk into the lecture room, the Reverend Dr. James Chuck, THD, senior adjunct professor of homiletics at the City School of Religion, senior pastor at the First Chinese Baptist Church of San Francisco, resplendent in a three-piece suit, Phi Beta Kappa key across his tummy with a chain, playing with the fob. And you couldn't believe the look of disdain as he appraised each of us as we walked into the room. As we sat down, he launched into a brief soliloquy on the general intellectual and spiritual decline of seminarians since his day, and then said, "The great preacher has 3 sermons that are revisited over and over again. And it would behoove us to figure out what our one sermon is quickly." Now, I think it's important because whatever else we talk about, we actually will turn out to have a sermon. And it will behoove each of you to know what that sermon is, because you're going to revisit it, and you can do it well or badly. Whatever you think actually it's not whatever else you think the subject will be, it is whatever else it is that you need to say when you deliver your talk. Just in case you want to know, I have over my 25 years in the parish, I believe I've had 3 sermons. I don't have 3 sermons. I had one after the other sequentially. My first was, "Can't we just get along?" It seemed like the right thing to say, to preach on when I was in over my head in that first little humanist parish in the upper Midwest. Then it was love over creed. It started getting juicy, and I felt I had something to say about all of that. Today, and for the last number of years, my sermon seems to always be, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, deal with it. So, and you'll find your own. And in all likelihood, if you give Dharma talks over some period of time, you will discover it will mutate and change. But there will be something there, and it's good to attend to it, to be clear. Now, there are things before you even get to the list. One is you really need to know what you're talking about. And that means 2 things. We're each of us doubly called to our practice, because we're no longer practicing primarily for ourselves. We are now practicing for those that we serve. The people that we speak to, we are practicing for them. We need to really throw our hearts into the matter, to really be present on it, and to do it for a long time. Like onto it, we need to know our tradition. And this is part of what I think this Shogaku Institute is so important for, is that as Zen came to the West, largely it was meditation practice, and people came like going to a gym, they'd go do their meditation, go home, and the whole great wealth of the tradition was not lost, but it wasn't in the first piece of luggage that was spoken. And I think some of our ethical lapses and the problems that we've had have come from the fact that we had that at first we really were all about meditation, and we kind of forgot that actually the Buddha Dharma comes to us in three, in a package of three. There is meditation, but there's also the ethical concerns, the sila, our practices of morality, and the great non-dual insight, seeing how we really are, each of us individuals following the trajectory of our lives, a great bundle of consequences and actions, and more consequences and intentions and more consequences and actions, and that we're bound together more tightly than the finest piece of fabric. We are even, it's proper to say, created out of each other. That this path is one of intimacy. We need to know that. We need to drink the water for ourselves and know for ourselves whether it's warm or cool. So, you got to have that. You got to keep coming back to it. You have to keep giving that your heart and your attention. We've become good by doing it. There have been some studies recently about experts, people who master various arts and disciplines, and they can actually calculate down to the number of days that you actually have to do something before you're good at it. It takes a while. So while you're waiting to get good at it, and we're talking specifically about the project of Dharma Talks, experiment. Try writing an entire Dharma talk, word for word, for how you're going to deliver it. I would like to suggest you may discover that there is nothing quite so ecstatic as discovering the Holy Spirit descending upon the sixth draft. I have even come to think that there's something really, it's not unhealthy, it's just stupid. There is a bias in our contemporary culture towards spontaneity. It's doubly reinforced in the Zen universe. I've heard people give talks that are not prepared. I've heard people give talks that are prepared. I'll take the prepared talk every time. What we tend to see with people who especially senior teachers who don't pay attention to this project, is they sit down and they just start stream of consciousness. And if we're lucky as listeners, they know the literature and they at least are weaving together a koan anecdote to another anecdote, to a koan anecdote, to another. Usually they're not even that good. But I don't want to say we're betraying the Dharma, but I'll let the question hang in the air. What is it that this is about? Are we showing off, or are we, aiming to heal the broken heart?
Do you think that some of this is a consequence of our profession needing, not having enough help, always being overwhelmed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we do have to keep in mind that people have very little time to prep. And usually an interesting experiment for me as a discipline is I teach it as a team with colleagues, and when we do sesshin, my colleagues, because they're all equal, like to present a case that we will explore throughout the course of the sesshin that's picked on the evening that the sesshin begins. And there's not a whole lot of time in there to prep for talks. It's been an interesting discipline. And, when you have 30, 40 years, of practice behind you, you can draw on that and do some interesting things. And we have that.
Because most people, they have to do something else for a living.
Right.
Most
And even, but even so, absolutely acknowledging that there's a press of time and nobody has, and I mean, my sermons get more time because somebody pays me to devote 15 or 18 hours a week to a 15-minute presentation. But, and we're not, I think I'm the only person in this room that has that privilege, but that doesn't happen for my marathon son. And that said, and that acknowledged, we have to fix it. You do need to pay attention.
it's that important. The value of spontaneity over communication isn't so good.
It is not so good. Spontaneity has its charms. It does generate an interesting turn of phrase every now and then. But when I was in seminary, I decided at some point after really sticking to, and I'll be talking a little bit about some of the traditional structures of sermons, but I decided, well, everybody else is saying, just preach it, brother. So I thought I would, and because there were only those 2 opportunities in one class in a seminary experience, and I needed a job when I got out. I mean, I was accruing a lot of debt. I was looking for work, and so I knew I had to have some experience preaching before I started actually trying to connect to a congregation. So I took every preaching gig I could possibly get, and I preached 2 or 3 times a month in the last half of my seminary experience. And at one of these, I was invited to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Aptos in Santa Cruz, and I decided I'm going to go without notes. So I very carefully thought, okay, well, 3 points. Point A leads to point B, leads to point C, in and out. And I arrived at the fellowship, and which we don't need to ask about the fellowship. They were polite, and I delivered my sermon. And in the coffee hour afterwards, based upon the comments that people made, I realized that I had missed point B. So now I have a particularly notoriously bad memory, and I suspect all of us, there are dangers in moving out there on the high wire. Now, the workhorse of anything up to now.
The AEC, is that a standard format?
I'm actually going to move right in with this next point on that, yes.
This Shuso ship was like that for me. 2 talks, go out now and do a bunch of stuff.
Right.
Wasn't enough for me.
Right. Well, and there it is. And there's the difficulty is your preparation is not the same as the typical seminary graduate. Who's making a living doing that. It's too bad because, again, I think this is like really important. I mean, when we do this, we're really trying to share something, to be of some use to people who, that litany in Frederick Buechner's, I mean, who knows what hurt is in this room, and what the turning word might be if we give it our, actually, the truth is, the turning word is always there, even if we fuck up terribly. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do our best. And So the workhorse of the Western homiletic experience is called 3 points and a poem. And
Points in a poem.
poem, or sometimes 3 points in a celebration. And so there it is. You have you have an entry point. It's often an illustration. It's often, well, each point should have its own illustration, but it often may be it could be a joke. It can be that has a point to it, not like the knockout joke in the recent trial. Some of us may have seen parts of. But something that points to the matter at hand. Often in the tradition which I practice, a koan is going to be in the top part, less so on Sunday. That is developed. It comes into a second point. The point is made, illustrated. That leads into the third point. That's made and illustrated. It should be winding together, and then something to hold up and inspire and push people out into the next step. The poem.
Something they can take away.
Your talk last night did that beautifully. And you can use readings, you can use, you don't feel confined to the Dharma literature, but the Dharma literature is a wonderful resource, and I thought it would now be nice to try and just show you an example of 3 points and a poem. Now the thing is, it's not 3 points. I mean, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 2. It's an organic thing. It's not necessarily a poem, but you can see this structure in the. They've been going on for a couple of hundred years, and I suspect while everybody's inventing new homiletic devices, and we're going to talk about one of them in a minute. This is the one people seem to keep coming back to. I think there's a reason for that. So, last Thursday evening, Jen and a host of us from church drove over to Cranston to join the throng, hoping to influence the school committee's decision whether to appeal the lower court ruling that the prayer banner on display at Cranston High School West be removed. As an admirer of young Jessica Alquist's principled and constitutionally informed stand on behalf of minority views, I was glad for how it turned out. If not quite so sanguine about what many people said or did during that hearing. I was distressed at how both atheism and humanism were blamed for pretty much all the ills we experience today. Of course, the way of the human brain, it reminded me of a joke. I'm sure you've heard it in one variation or another. The setup is simple as pie. A man is caught in a terrible automobile accident. It takes the jaws of life to extract him from the mangle. He's on the stretcher. The EMTs look him over, and one says to the other, "It doesn't look good. Should I call a priest?" The other EMT notices a button with a flaming chalice on his jacket and says, "No, he's a Unitarian Universalist. Call a math teacher." Now, I think the spirit, the worthy point that hides within this joke, is also expressed within something Henry David Thoreau once said. When asked his opinion about the afterlife, Henry replied, "One world at a time." Call a math teacher. One world at a time. When people think of Unitarian Universalists, they often think of humanism. In light of the harsh things said about humanism at that meeting, perhaps it would be good to pause and think about it. Today, I want to talk about humanism, what it means, and what it has to do with us as a community of faith. And today seems particularly appropriate to do so. Not only is it in the wake of our local turmoil around civil liberties and blaming atheists and humanists for upsetting the cart for all sorts of bad things, but as it happens, Nicholas Copernicus happened to be born on this day in 1473. Quite literally a Renaissance man. He was a jurist, a mathematician, and an astronomer. And frankly, when I think humanist, I think of someone rather like him. Copernicus was also ordained within the Roman Catholic Church. His exact rank isn't completely clear, but almost certainly a priest. He was, after all, once nominated to be a bishop. He also caused the church a great deal of unease, and for some who followed his work, considerable discomfort, as his relentless pursuit of truth led him to prove the previously universally accepted opinion the earth stood at the center of things was not so. Replacing the earth with the sun and then going one step further, establishing even our sun, which we're twirling about, is not the center of things. Now, it is probably worth noting he chose to wait until his deathbed to publish. And consequences of his work would, as I said, fall on other shoulders. Think Giordano Bruno and Galileo. Humanism lived does upset hearts. But for our brief time together, what I really want to hold up is the possibility of finding the sacred within the natural realm, which best as I can tell is something that marked Copernicus's life and work, and which I suggest is what humanism is all about. Back to that joke. Back to one world at a time. I hope you'll allow me a strong statement about who we are. Yes, we have absolute freedom of conscience, and no one is forced to assent to any statement made anywhere by any one of us, including from this pulpit or by me. But here's the truth. Any serious observer can see something as common among us, so common as to be descriptive. We are, within our tradition, for the most part, humanists. And we have been, since our foundation, humanists. This humanism works for atheists, agnostics, and theists of many different flavors. At the school committee meeting, I understand Greg Epstein at the Harvard Humanist Chaplain was there. I didn't get to meet him, but I am quite interested in his work. I believe what he is offering at Harvard maps closely what we do. He just markets it to atheists and the closely aligned. We, at our best, are far less discriminating. And I think there are good reasons for our humanism to be so wildly, extravagantly, promiscuously so. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In fact, in recent decades, there's been a bit of confusion about our basic humanist stance. I think this is so for a number of reasons. For one, because to many, humanism has come to be associated with a hard and uncompromising atheism. Think of the new atheists who take no prisoners and are relentlessly judgmental about anyone who uses religious language. This, in fact, was a stance taken during much of the 20th century by many of our own. Today, for many of us, a large majority, I would say, such a bare, aggressive, and frequently bitterly angry atheism, understandable as it might be considering how atheists are so frequently and unjustly treated, just isn't what we're about. Even, I hasten to add, as we cherish atheism and agnosticism as viable stances within our association, particularly agnosticism. But again, I'm inclined to rush ahead of myself. Another reason I suggest for the confusion arises out of our association with Hungarian-speaking Unitarians. They're a compelling faith community touching many of our hearts as people who have suffered terribly for their faith in one God, and for that reason people call Unitarian. We have a sense of, but for the luck of the draw, there goes we. And on balance, I think our association has been good for both communities. But because of that shared name, which has brought us together, and because they're a Reformation church, and therefore from the early mid-16th century, while English-speaking Unitarianism is an Enlightenment phenomenon, and therefore dating from the mid-late 17th century, many of us assume that the one led to the other. Many people, thinking we come from them, have come to think their spiritual concerns are ours. This is, however, not so. It arises from a common enough error, a logical fallacy known as post hoc ergo propter hoc, or post hoc for short. Reformation Unitarianism, which arose and flourishes in Hungarian-speaking countries, was about the nature of God pretty much completely within a Christian context. These continue to be their concerns, but they are not ours. Enlightenment Unitarianism, which arose and flourishes in English-speaking countries, was about how we approach reality, most distinctively approaching religion with a critical eye. The term Unitarian itself, that one God part of our position, was almost incidental to us. We did reject Trinity as there was no conclusive evidence for it within the Scriptures. It was not logical for a sinful doctrine to lack unambiguous support in the primary text. The name was given to us by those who didn't like us and thought it was the most insulting thing they could do. Until the blessed William Ellery Channing accepted the name on our behalf, and it is a nice name, we tended to call ourselves liberals, and our faith stance was called rational religion. Throughout, our real concern was how to live a holy life, a life of meaning and purpose in the world in which we found ourselves. And following that light steadily over the years, we shifted from being a liberal Christian church to becoming a liberal church with Christians. Actually, we're a liberal church with Christians, Jews, Buddhists, pagans, atheists, and deists, and agnostics, along with many, many miscellaneous others. The liberal thread that has joined the many different faces of English-speaking Unitarianism is called religious humanism, or rational religion, or, for short, humanism. Of course, humanism is another term that has different senses within different communities. So let me give a brief definition for what we tend to mean. We do not mean humans are the center of things. By humanism, we here tend to mean whatever else might be true. Our focus, our concern, our delight is found in this world as we actually encounter it. Humanism is a path of humility. It follows the great dictum of not knowing, of not settling, of endless curiosity. Humanism is finding our way within a natural world, in which our natural ability to reason and its great flowering as scientific method are seen as things to be cherished and fostered. And we don't stop there. Humanism is also about music and art and dance. It is all about embodiment. That said, the club is big. Atheist? Great. Christian? Wonderful. We're all welcome. This is why we've been able to welcome pagans and Buddhists in significant numbers into our community over the past decades. The deal is, we have a covenant of presence to each other and to this precious, hurting world. Look at us in this spiritual community as we actually are, shortcomings and accomplishments all taken together, and you can see what this can mean. In this lovely old meeting house today, we count that wild kaleidoscopic range of views as natural. What runs a current, a great rushing tide through our hearts and makes us as one within all our many spiritualities is that profound this-worldliness. Just this. Just this. Examined and loved and lived. Lived. That's why social justice is so important to us. It follows our humanist spirituality, our looking at who we are, really are, and that finding of how we are one family. Knowing this, how can we help but act to be of some use in the healing of hurt? Of course, this approach to life can have its shadows, and does. Within our history, we see how we can be hyper-rational and miss the music of our lives. I've already noted how this narrowness marked many of us through much of the 20th century. And sometimes we can overreact to our rationalism and can get pretty mushy. So, for instance, we provided a fair amount of the leadership for the spiritualist movement in the late 19th century. Not our most rational moment. But also, whether some large part of us tilts one way or the other, somehow we always seem to correct. And moving a bit one way or another over time, the current that holds for us is a dynamic and spiritual humanism. Over the past near 300 years, of all the Western religions, we've seen the one most clearly identified with the rational and the naturalistic. Not the only ones. We owe an enormous debt to the rationalist and humanist current in Judaism. And there are similar rational currents within Christianity, lifted, one could argue, from classical Greek philosophy, but there nonetheless. I think it a delight to learn that the American Episcopal Church celebrates a feast for Copernicus. The telling difference is their feast is on the anniversary of his death. Well, they mean that in a good sense. But our marking today is for his birth. So, what might all this look like for us as we go forward? A while back, the comic book writer Alan Moore, creator of Watchmen, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, as well as V is for Vendetta, was interviewed for The New Humanist. Perhaps ironically, maybe simply fortuitously, he summarized what I think is our work as spiritual humanists. My basic premise, said Moore, is that human beings are amphibious in the etymological sense of two lives. We have one life that is the solid material world, that is most perfectly measured by science. Science is the most exquisite tool that we've developed for measuring that hard, physical, material world. Then there is the world of ideas, of the mind, which is inside our head. I would say that both of these worlds are equally real. They're just real in different ways. I believe our work today as a community is to bring the worlds of science and poetry and myth together, to join head and heart, to find the spirituality, the spirit, the breath of hope within our ordinary lives. We are called to live in this world and to dream dreams of the possible. The work we can do out of that knowing, well, really is a not knowing. It is that endless curiosity which arises in the human heart opened, is nothing less than sacred. And let me tell you a secret. The world needs this. It needs us. Amen.
James, is that on the internet?
Yeah, I was looking for, I wanted an example of this and an example of the other kind of sermon. Done. So it's 5 points. The nature of the pulpit that I serve, they want the sermon to approach 20 minutes. I think that's a little long for us. In fact, I'm going to talk about this a little. I was going to talk about this a little later, but I think it probably fits here. When I was doing my internship during my seminary experience, I was at the first Unitarian Church in San Jose, here in California, and it was on something called St. James Square. There's a park, and there were several other churches, and it turned out there's an Episcopal church that didn't lock its doors, and so on breaks I would go over and just sort of sit in the pews and do zazen. And then one time I realized there was nobody else in the sanctuary, and I am a seminarian, so I walked up and stood at the pulpit. And it's kind of a grand, little Gothic-y kind of church, and a big pulpit with a little lectern there. And then cellophane tape right square in the middle of the lectern was a 3x5 card, and on that it was typed in all caps, "No one has ever been saved after 10 minutes." And so whatever, the preachers always had to see that before they popped their notes down on the this sermon was 18 minutes, and it's I mentioned it's an academic pulpit. They want more than other congregations might want. Still, what you see in that, the content aside, the structure there is it goes forward, there's a little loop, it goes forward, there's a little loop, it goes forward, there's a little loop. I tried to count. I think depending on how you perceive it, it's 4 points or 5. But there's your deep anatomy of 3 points and a poem. So any comments or thoughts about how that? And I'm sorry, before that, just this pulpit is this massive monstrosity. It's called a bench pulpit. It stands 15 feet in the air. You have to, the guy having to hitch up his robe to walk up the stairs. I hitch up my robe and walk up the stairs every Sunday, and it's a nosebleed, sort of. And we've been trying to get recordings of this, and unfortunately, the gallery balcony around it is almost 20 feet from the nearest spot you can put a camera and we have no budget for audio visuals, so that's what you can. So about the structure, was that sufficient as an example? Is there anything that you'd like to talk about for that?
I was having a hard time hearing the whole thing, but I'll listen to it later on YouTube. I was listening more to the cadence of your style of speech. I was wondering, is that natural for you? Did you pick that up from somebody? It reminds me of a couple of other people that I've seen on stage. And I was just wondering where that originates from.
That's a wonderful question about what is the natural voice for speaking. This is a cavernous hall. The fire marshal says it seats 830. Our congregation is large, but it's not that large. So you have to have, you have to speak, you have to project in order to own the pulpit and to be present. So there is a certain amount of volume, even though it's magnified, there's a certain amount of volume that's being projected, and that changes the timbre of the voice in that situation a little bit more than I would speak in another context. My general preaching style has evolved. It's been literally a quarter of a century since I began doing this, and I listen to preachers. I can't name who seeped into my bones and became part of who I am as I preach. But I have a relatively measured style, and my delivery is, I try to enunciate. Although as a kid who was raised on the wrong side of the tracks, and while I have a gigantic bloated vocabulary, it mainly came from reading, not from hearing. And so one of my congregation last year, as recently as last year, said I pronounced the same word 5 different ways in that in a sermon. But I can't name the specific source. And there's no right one. There's a lot of interest in the African American homiletic style, and there is a distinctive style that when black preachers depart from it, they catch some flack. Obama's a great example of somebody who has picked up cadences and turns of phrase from his years with Reverend Wright at I forget the name of the church, the United Church of Christ congregation outside of Chicago. Classic black preacher. He preached at our Service of the Living Tradition, the Unitarian Universalist annual convention, and he was man on fire.
Reverend Wright.
Call and response.
Very much. There's a lot of that element in it, which you don't see here. This is, except for my very first pulpit, my congregations have all been nestled into academic communities, and they want to be able to hear the footnotes.
Following up on Azo's point, I was noticing just in terms of the language, or the grammatical structure, where often sentences were ended with a verb.
Yeah.
Is that intentional?
Yes. I mean, yes, I've thought about what I do.
Okay.
And part of the intention there is to pull people forward.
Right. I can feel that in the process, and I was wondering what it was doing about it.
And I think you've seen the device and that's the little loop that it's not consciously a transition point, but it usually becomes one. YouTube's interesting. I mean, you can pull up people from all sorts of different religious traditions. You can hear their sermons, and recommend, you know, yeah, some of them, the theological content is so offensive that you just can't, I can't endure it. But finding things that are compatible, there's quite a large range, and you know, and for most Buddhist Unitarian sermons, will are a relatively safe place to look for people who've been preaching a while that you can find, you can listen to, like this one about humanism, probably offended nobody here, but has structural stuff that is useful.
What I noticed is that you really own the silences in a way that I would like to be able to do. And was that just something that came with time? Was there anything in particular you did to work on that?
Actually, that's an interesting thing, because my abiding sin at front end of my preaching life was speaking too fast. You know, I would overwrite, and which is the other you know, probably the one thing that people who the rookie mistake in Dharma talks and sermons is trying to say everything. You think this is it, this is my moment, I gotta say everything. And my solution to that was talking real fast. It wasn't well received. So yeah,
so you slowly tried to slow yourself down?
Slow. Well, yeah, you know, I mean, there's as we speak, you know, as we have opportunities to speak, there's definitely a feedback loop, and if we are attending to it, it will change. You know, we will need it, and because again, this is not. There is a performance quality, and having some kind of theatrical insight is not a bad thing. As long as that doesn't overtake it, as long as it's not all presentation. There's got to be content as well. But when I'm talking with people about getting married, the young people particularly, I say that the bottom line deal is the promises the two of you are making. If you're clear on that, then the bottom line is the two of you making promises to each other. Then there's all sorts of other stuff. Then there's a party, there's making family happy, there's a celebration, and there's theater. And you know, there's these little strategies about how they stand and things that make it more inviting and allow the larger thing to happen. And it always works as long as they remember the bottom line is the two of them making their promises to each other. Similarly with us, if we understand that we're here to point to the deeper truths, to invite people into the way of the healed heart, we can take advantage of these devices. We can create the 3 points and a poem. We can use any number of other devices, which I want to go well up to this point. So every 15 minutes, somebody's inventing a new homiletic device. This is the best thing since sliced cheese. And sometimes they become, and sometimes they enter into what it is that we're going to do. And the one that I found most interesting is something called the narrative sermon, and it abandons the full thrust of the logical argument, and instead is all about the image. The message, the image is the message. Usually, but not necessarily, it's a story. And in the pure narrative, there's no no exegetical moment. There's no explaining what it is. It's just there, and it's a really interesting model. I can't quite go that far. I have to midrash it a little bit, at the end, but it can be quite moving. And I wanted to. I hope it's okay to inflict one more. This is a little bit shorter, but it is a pretty good example of the narrative sermon style.
Somewhere at the beginning of the 9th century in China, at a brief flowering during the long decline of the Great Tang Dynasty, the Emperor Xianzhang was reconsolidating power, engaging one after another of the military governors who had come to rule much of the empire. On the one hand, it was a violent and dangerous time. On the other, a time of arts and poetry and profound spiritual teachings. It was one of what the Chinese, past masters of irony, have come to call interesting times. In those days, the abbot Baizhang Weihai, called Baizhang for the mountain in which his monastery was nestled, was one of the greats of the Zen way, helping to shape what would be transmitted for the next 1,000 years. His monastic rule would become the standard for the community, fiercely committed to a life of meditation and work, as being two facets of the way he lived by the precept, a day of no work is a day of no eating. And sometime after this story that I will be recounting, when his health began to fail, and his monks worrying for him in his gardening tools, he sat at the meal and refused to eat. His rate was returned before the next meal. He was a fierce teacher of a way pointing to the power of this life we all share, the human way, the way of the wise heart. I count him as one of my heroes and one of my teachers. I also believe he has things to say to us, you and me, as we try to find the liberal way in religion, what I consider another facet of that path of the wise heart. He offers a compliment to our own attempts at being authentic, at being present, and fully engaged. Now, when someone as important in the history of a spiritual tradition as Baizhang, well, history and myth, of course, intertwine. And so it is with this story. The abbot was in the habit of giving a talk that was open to anyone, whether a monk, a nun, or just someone in the neighborhood. At some point, he noticed within the congregation an old man who had something peculiar about him, like an aura, but of what sort Baizhang couldn't say. The old man would always stand near the back of the assembly and would vanish before the abbot could get back and speak with him. Finally, one day the old man lingered and Baizhang said to him, "Who are you?" or "What is it you are? And why are you coming here?" The old man smiled thinly, bowed, and said, "You're very perceptive. I am in fact not a human being. Many ages ago, I was abbot on this mountain, heading an assembly of monks following the way. Now, it's worth noticing that would mean, as abbot on the same mountain, even if 1,000 years before, the ghost was also an abbot Baizhang. The old man continued. He said, "A sincere student of the way came to me and asked if someone who had awakened to her true nature, who saw clearly the play of life and death, and had achieved wisdom, was that person bound by the laws of cause and effect or not?" And asked Baizhang, "What did you say?" The old man shuddered. "I said such a person is not bound by the laws of cause and effect." There was a horrific silence that felt like endless suffering. Baizhang thought perhaps he smelled the whiff of sulfur. Finally, the old man added, "And ever since I've been reincarnating as a fox spirit. So far, 500 times. You need to understand a fox spirit in ancient China is a very bad thing. A malevolent being, very dangerous, big time bad karma." The ghost leaned close to Bai Zhang, his breath smelling of rotten flesh. Bai Zhang could see his eyes had no whites, and his teeth weren't human, but razor sharp, a fox's. Please, the spirit begged, say a turning word and free me from this hell. A turning word. I think probably we've all encountered such a thing in our lives. A friend says something, maybe we've even read it somewhere. Maybe we have heard it 1,000 times before, but this time we get it, really get it. And from that, our lives shift, and we go in a new direction. It's part of the human mystery that we have a hand in our destiny. We can make decisions. We can change course. Bai Zhang didn't hesitate. He replied, the true person of the way, she or he who has achieved wisdom, is at one with the laws of cause and effect. Another translation of these words says, that person does not avoid the laws. And another, how the wise person does not obscure the laws. Don't obscure. Do not avoid. Be at one with. It was as if a bubble popped. With nothing at all changing, the world was now different, now new. Have you had this experience of something, small or large? It is a gift. We don't find it by asserting, but by opening. Some people call it grace. The ghost made vows explaining that he had truly heard, truly understood, and this was his last incarnation as a fox spirit. He then added, my body lies a ways away on the side of the mountain. Would you please find it and give me a monk's funeral? Bai Zhang agreed, and the fox spirit disappeared. That sulfurous smell gone. Instead, there was a lingering odor of sweet grass. The abbot called for his assistant and told him to announce to the community that after the new meal, there would be a monastic funeral. When they heard this, the monks were confused, as one said, no one's in the infirmary. What does this mean? But they lived under rule, and after the meal, they all followed the old abbot as he walked out of the monastery and on, until he came to a spot where he took his staff, poked it out, and found the fox body. They returned and gave the fox a suitable funeral, burning the body and scattering the ashes. That evening, Bai Zhang told his assembly the whole story. The senior student, Wang Bo, stood up and said, Sir, what if the old abbot had given the right answer every time? What would have happened then? Bai Zhang smiled, fingered his teacher's stick, and said, Come here, Wang Bo, and I'll tell you. It's a dangerous moment. Somewhat different danger than between Fox and Bai Zhang to encounter a Zen teacher with a stick in his or her hand. Wang Bo would become another of the teachers who created what we now call Zen. According to tradition, sources said he was a giant of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, while his teacher was barely 5 feet, short even for his era. When the younger monk walked up to his teacher just before coming face to face and just out of reach from his teacher's stick, Wang Bo reached out and slapped the old abbot. Now, up to this moment, perhaps you have had a sense of the point to be found in this story. The moral, as it were. But what do you do with this part? I have a friend who has studied this way for many years and can't get past the violent images sometimes found in Zen. Shouts, shoves, slaps. My suggestion here again is how the answer isn't going to be found if we choose to know what's what and impose something on the encounter. Let it be, as one great teacher suggested, just put it down. Allow that maybe there's a point in it for us, for me, for you. If we just for a moment allow what is unbidden, but mainly it comes to those who are open rather than closed. As for Bai Sheng, the old abbot laughed and declared, "They say the barbarian has a red beard, but here is a red-bearded barbarian." This is not quite as obscure as perhaps that sounds. The red-bearded barbarian is the founder of Zen Bodhidharma, a barbarian because he came from India, and anyone not from China is a barbarian. And red-bearded because, well, he had a red beard. Here's a simple declaration of delight at his student and a suggestion of how wisdom was being presented to the whole assembly, an invitation to a deeper stance than merely a nod to moral convictions. Okay, this is a Zen story. It's what's called a koan, a direct pointing to reality with an invitation to our own most intimate demonstration of how we understand the matter. In formal koan introspection practice, there are in fact 5 points to unravel within this story, for some 6. For our purposes, let's talk about 2. First, let's look at that turning phrase about responsibility and our place in the universe, and then just a little about that concluding encounter, turning on the question, well, what if the correct answer was given each time? Suitable questions not only for Zen monks in ancient China, but also just as much for us, for Unitarian Universalists in contemporary Providence. I strongly suggest critical questions for people seeking the ways of the wise heart, a full-bodied encounter with this world, allowing us to walk with some grace upon this good earth. So, what is cause and effect? It is understood many ways in different traditions and cultures, but essentially across cultures, I suggest we find 2 points. The first is how things relate. One thing, or usually a number, sometimes many, causing something. Literally, cause and effect. And this relates to us as much as to anything else. We, you and I, are moments in a great play of events. A metaphor we like is how we're all bound up together within a web of intimacy. The point is, everything is connected. And out of that realization, we see how everything counts. Every action, every thought has consequences. The Christian writer C.S. Lewis had a vision of hell where there is always an exit, a way out. But what takes people to hell is them cutting themselves off from each other. And in hell, they just continue to separate themselves, moving ever farther from the bus stop that goes to heaven every day. So, the more we follow the actions and thoughts that are damaging, the more cut off we are. And while there's always a ticket out, it gets ever more difficult. We are what we do. I am what I do. You are what you do. And whatever that is, unless we notice and take corrective action, we just become more of it. So a caution for us. And several invitations. Pay attention and do good is sound advice. But this is not just a lesson from a Methodist Sunday school. There's another invitation to be found in that last bit, that conversation with the slap in the lap. Frankly, is what makes this something interesting for me, and perhaps for you. It is an invitation to a life of delight in this world of tears. We're being invited into a deep ecology, the great earth household. An invitation is being extended for us to see how our lives are so intimately interconnected that what one does affects what each of us will be. Here's the secret consequence of that truth. We're all going to be reborn as foxes. There is no escape from this life. There is no purity beyond this mess. There is no place we can stand where we will not be splattered with mud from the road. Here we find we're called to the ways of the wise heart, where we see how each and every one of us is precious beyond description, as we are. And our very existence is inextricably bound up with everyone and everything else. The text calls us to who we really are. The true person of the way, she or he who has achieved wisdom, does not avoid, does not obscure, but rather is at one with the laws of cause and effect. If we know this from our bones and marrow, then grace dances into our lives, and we will find ourselves transformed. And the fox, and the human, and the mountains, and the great ocean, and the vast skies, and you and I become ever more intimate than even our dreams had ever said. One family, one life. That's what it's about. That's what we're about. Nothing less. So, as you can see, not fully the narrative sermon, because there's commentary and pulling it, but the weight of the message is in the story itself. Sadly, there aren't too many koans that are quite that elaborate and ongoing that you can do it. There are a couple you can shag your dog up if you want. Comments or thoughts or questions about the structure of the narrative sermon, or the narrative sermon sort of.
We had talked a little bit earlier about how the story pulls people in and gets them emotionally involved and makes a connection for them. What's your experience with that? Is it should we try to have something like that in every talk? Kind of a
No, I don't
a
think
hook
that.
kind
Right.
of a deal.
Well, hook. You need a hook. You do. You need somewhere along the line there should be. Actually, it was on Facebook. There was some little list about some series of exchanges about sermons and what should be in a sermon. And an old and dear friend, Ellen Skenger, after people offered their various opinions about how it should be structured and what it should be. Ellen is an old Zen hand. She's a Dharma person for 30 years and an active UU member of a lay member of the congregation. She said, "We like stories and jokes. We like stories and jokes, lots of them." And she may maybe emphasize the joke part of it a little bit, but I think part of your presentation was that there is a point in image as communication that's very primary. We really relate to stories. Actually, as a preacher, I have bitterly learned that people may not remember much after they leave the finest argument, but they will remember the story. And so, to the degree that you can have an anecdote, it doesn't have to be personal. It's really nice if it ties to you, unless it's rote, unless well, I'm into the fourth paragraph. It's time to bring myself into the thing. That doesn't work. But as or it works the first 4 or 5 times. Grounding it in story is the primary thing. Secondarily, my story, allowing people the access. Which is why I like this narrative form. I think it captures, it's of the various models that I've seen out there that depart from that old workhorse. The one that seems to most have potential particularly for us, I think, is if we're given the opportunity, if the subject of the Dharma talk lends itself to a story, the story can carry the whole thing, depending.
It also helps you
But you don't have to go to your notes much, because you know the story.
It's
and
true.
You can just tell the story in a very engaging, very
And you have to do, you know, there is something, it's interesting about that, you know, there is a time and place thing about how formal the structure needs to be and how tightly written it has. I have a friend who became the minister of one of our largest churches, a 2,000 member congregation, which for Unitarians is pretty big. And she had made her bones as an extemporaneous preacher. You know, she was like really popular and kind of famous when she got the call. Within 6 months of beginning to serve there, she stopped speaking extemporaneously and only preached from the manuscript. And because the crowd was going to, you know, there was going to be there were going to be people in the crowd who were going to catch the inconsistencies and the logical failings of speaking that way. And in that community, that was among the unforgivable sins.
Those of us who don't have 40 years of experience and don't know all the koan stories and all the wonderful Zen stories, we need like a concordance where you can go, okay, under the heading of karma, we can look up at such. Here's a list of stories we can go to.
It is interesting in Orthodox Christian, not big O, but in Christian preaching, they have these cheat sheets and you can subscribe to where, because often they follow a lectionary and there's and you can buy canned sermons, you know, that they package it. It's like the things for colleges, for papers. We don't have that. Although that does take us back to the first point. Before we even worry too much about it's primary. It must inform us all the way through is our personal practice, you know, constantly returning to the pillow, and actually knowing our tradition are essential. We can't do without either of those. And so it's incumbent upon us who've taken on some responsibilities, accepted responsibilities, or even reached out for them, to step up to the plate and find time and study. You know, there's perfectly good secondary literature. It doesn't have to be boring out there. There's for the narrative accounts, Jack Shoemaker and Nelson Foster have a very good anthology of Zen teachings that pays attention to the women in the
A little bit.
not as much as, well, I mean,
It was revolutionary.
it was
They put a
revolutionary.
few in.
Right. And after that, what's the thing that Judy Reitman and her, there's another source, I think it's called Source Book of.
Yeah, maybe Zen Source Book,
Yeah.
that might be the name of the
Yeah.
tree, right?
Yeah.
And Stephen Addis and her husband, Stan Lombardo,
Yeah.
translators and things. But may I suggest you Google?
Google.
I Google a lot.
The
I
Google
lot.
machine is
I
really.
YouTube and I Google a lot.
There
That's
are a
why-
lot of Dharma talks out there. And when you Google a subject in Buddhism or Zen or a koan, you're going to get some talk.
Also, there's another little advantage in reading other people's talks or listening to other people's talks. Not only do you find a lot of really good things there, but you also discover, my goodness, if this clown can do it, I'm not quite as bad as I thought.
Do you ever, is there any sort of a sermon structure that's sort of a contrasting one state from another?
Oh, sure. I only picked these two because it is the workhorse. It is the one that people just return to over and over because it works. And I'm just fascinated with the narrative form because I think it can
In our tradition.
in our tradition, it can really be adapted really well. There are hundreds of models. Mostly they rise, they turn out not to work. Or they work in this this context at this moment. But absolutely, and play, because you don't know what your situation is going to be, even though this is so important. If there isn't heart in it, if there isn't pleasure and play in it, you're not presenting the true dharma.
Just the contrast model, you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and you have a synthesis. That's a three-part model,
Yeah, well, it is,
right
yeah.
there.
That can be a 3-point.
That's
little
right,
table,
and you can
know.
do the contrast right there, and
Yeah.
then the resolution.
But not to make it just an argument, illustrate each time.
3 points under each.
Well, and that's the most classical form. The 3 has 3. But we're also talking about a period, 100 years ago, the average sermon was an hour. 50 years before that, the average sermon was an hour and a half. 50 years before that, the average sermon was 3 hours. But of course there was no other form of entertainment either. No TV, no
A
radio.
Sunday movie.
No movies.
No video games.
And people would, and literally sermons would be written up, published in in the newspapers.
Susan has them.
Well, actually, it fits perfectly with what you just said, maybe. You use these two, theatrical, literally a prop, two props.
I did.
Have you ever gone further and done?
I'm pretty conservative about that.
Are you? Yeah.
Other people, that's about as far as I go. It just happens that I have a staff and a coat suit, so and fit and I didn't think it was too over the top.
Have you seen it done well? Is maybe a better question.
Yes, it can be done well, but it's dangerous. People who use props tend to rely too heavily on them. I have a couple of colleagues who like to use puppets, and generally my experience of it is that they tend to be a substitute for substance.
Yeah.
But
Well,
they don't have to be.
We had a discussion of this based on your talk, that there is a very razor edge between using a device and feeling drawn in and feeling manipulated.
Right.
And so when you do that, it needs to come up a little bit. I mean, that's even more manipulative, but that's okay. Let it come up a little spontaneously as you worked through your talk.
Did you use it? Puppet?
No. But I had a picture of an armadillo.
Oh, cool.
No, it was your awe.
Oh.
Asking us to awe with you.
Oh.
Awe.
Oh.
I was just curious, in the Buddhist tradition, is there like a lecture or order that impresses you a lot that people can?
I don't really know what the classical form of the Teisha was. What I have heard from our teachers, I think from our East Asian teachers, is shockingly standard exegesis. There's the koan, this is what it means. And usually not very well. There's no personal thing to it. It's a very stereotyped structure and not adaptable to our culture. In my experience, which is probably why we don't have a lot of examples of that. We were talking, a couple of us were talking about secondary koan commentaries, and the only books that really touch on that, the only literature that is on one collection, the Gameless Gate, the Women's One, and I was speculating why I think that Koan Yamada's book is the least interesting, is that I think it's pretty straight. They just pull Teisho's, his talks, and maybe tightened the sentence structure up a little bit and published it. But Zenke Shibiyama and Robert Aitken's commentaries, while clearly there were talks in their ancestry, they've been worked and turned into the essay form. So actually that if I recall correctly, if not the Fox story, certainly another koan, I've done something with that where in my most recent book, there are maybe a third of the chapters had some distant connection to a talk, a sermon or a Dharma talk or something, but they're different forms, and they, I couldn't just take it. I couldn't take this talk and make it the chapter in a book and have it work, whereas it did work in the
In your lecture itself.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I was,
I think I wandered on that, yeah.
What I was asking, and again, I don't think I was clear. Is there anybody, say, speaking in the modern day, in the Buddhist tradition that impresses you, that you think people might be able to benefit from watching?
I'm sorry. Oh, that was, yeah.
Watching.
That's right. I was doing the, what was it? I took I had a brief class on dealing with journalists. You know, you answer the question you want to answer. That are online, no. I mean, I think when he's on his game, John Tarrant is, remarkably good at this. He also is one of those people who will fall back on the fact that he's got an endless well of stories and does that stream of consciousness thing that pisses me off. But when he's good, he's real good.
He's very clever.
Yeah, he's fast. He's fast. He's smart, and there's something to say. I wouldn't just say clever.
No, but that's what you hear in the talk, that
When he's
just
right,
doing that thing.
he will, and I've seen other people do this where they rely on their cleverness
That's all.
because it didn't bother them to prep.
We probably should end now and